Welcome everybody to this meeting. It's actually a Colloquy cycle, and today we have Alexander Lex. I think it's the third time or something that you come here, but we still managed within the time of this.
Yes.
Alex is an associate professor of computer science at the Institute of Data, and he's also the director of the visualization center there. He's a recipient of the NSF Career Award and also multiple best paper awards, and co-founder of Data Vision. It's a startup company which does visual analytics solutions for pharmaceutical industry. Before that, he was a lecturer and postdoc at Harvard, and before that, he did his PhD, masters, and bachelor's at the Arts, where he chaired office with very interesting people. I wish one. Currently, he's on the sabbatical in Linz, where he's working in his startup. And I think the startup is together with Mark Stein, right?
Yes.
That was the other interesting person in the room. Today, he will be talking about empirical evaluation of complex interactive visualization techniques, a topic which slightly differs from the talk that he gave, or significantly differs, I guess, from the talk that he gave at the DRV forum. So I hope everybody has been there. And Alex was very good when I asked him to do another talk. But I'm sure it will be great. So the floor is yours. And yeah.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. Well, as Manu already said, I'm a professor at the University of Utah. This is a picture, the most recent picture of my research group. You probably know this face here, Mariah Maya. She used to run the lab together with me, but unfortunately she has moved to Sweden last summer. So right now there's no PI in our lab in Utah. We both escaped to Europe, but I'll be going back to Utah. So the other thing that I do, in addition to being a professor, is being like a co-founder of a startup. And this is actually where I spent my year right now. This is a company that I founded together with Mark Streit, Niels Galenborg, who is like a professor at Harvard Medical School, Samuel Gratzel, who was one of Mark's students. And then we have our CPO, basically the person who runs the business, Dominic Girardi. He's a bioinformatician. And what we do is we build solutions, visualization solutions, data analysis solutions for the pharmaceutical industry. It's kind of like a mix between project and product-based work that we do. This is a little bit outdated. We're 25 people now, and we're still growing. So it's been an exciting year for me to kind of see a different kind of working with data visualization. Okay. As Manu said, I'm going to give a completely different talk than I usually give, but I'll have my first 10 slides are the same. So if you've seen this before, please, I'm sorry. So I like to start my talks with this quote that you've seen before: "The purpose of computing is insight, not numbers." This is by Richard Hamming, and obviously everybody would agree. If I run a supercomputer, I do this not to kind of like get some numbers, but to learn something about a phenomenon such as, for example, weather or any other simulation that you might care about. If you slightly modify this quote to "the purpose of visualization is insight, not pictures," you get to another quote that you might have seen. This is from Card, McNally, and Schneiderman in their book from the 90s. Might have been coined earlier even than that. But it's kind of like, of course, we do visualization so that people understand data, right? We don't do visualization just to make things pretty. But it turns out this isn't always the case. Here's like a kind of like data set that I like to refer to. This is like of the banana genome and some other plants. And so let's suppose you have these 6 different plants and you want to understand how they are related. You might want to ask, like, how many shared genes do they have? And the more shared genes they have, the more closely they are related. And so when in 2012, somebody published a paper about the banana genome and its relationship to these other plants, this is the data visualization they used. And I call this the infamous banana Venn diagram. And so this is like a terrible visualization. It's kind of like catchy, right? It makes your paper pretty, but it doesn't do anything in terms of like communicating what's going on. What do I mean by that? So let's take a look at this tiny segment up here. This tiny segment, which you don't even know which plants intersect here, represents 1,151 shared genes. And right next to it, a segment of the equal size only represents 40 genes. So there's no proportionality of how important something is in a data set to how big or how salient it is. Similarly, down here, you have like a gigantic segment with 105 shared genes. So clearly that's a problem. And this is like a problem that isn't completely an isolated incident. So if you look, you find those diagrams everywhere, at least before 2012. There are these, like there's a pine, this is supposed to be a rat, and this is supposed to be like a mouse genome, and so on. So you find many of these Venn diagrams, which kind of tells you that this is an important problem to solve. So I saw this figure and I thought, can we do better? And it turns out you can. So what we did is we kind of like took a slightly less fancy approach, but we essentially are building up a matrix here. So we have 3 sets A, B, and C in the columns, and I'm just showing you the Venn diagram as a reference here on the left, on the right. And then we start encoding rows. So the first row is it's in no set. The second row is just in A, then just in B, just in C, A and B combination, A and C combination, and so on. So now we've kind of like uniquely identified every possible intersection of this Venn diagram, and we can very easily plot the size of these intersections by simply plotting a bar chart, right? The cardinality. And so here, this is kind of like easy to spot now. Like the biggest one is this AC combination. So let's look at how this looks like for the banana Venn diagram. So here's our banana Venn diagram. Here's the corresponding upset plot. So one thing we immediately see is that the largest intersection includes all sets, something that's not really clear from the banana Venn diagram, right? This is kind of like interesting because we know that now that these plants are actually quite related. They have a lot of common ancestry. They share more genes than they actually have apart. The second thing we might see is that the 3 leftmost species here, they participate in the second and in the third largest intersection as well. So that tells us that those 3 species are probably more related to each other than they are to the other 3. And then we can also look at this one here. This is the date. That really only participates in an intersection down here. So what we can learn from that is that this is probably the most different of these plants. So this might be the prettier figure, but this is a figure where you can actually read something that is useful for an analyst, right? And of course, being good visualization people, we built an interactive system that had all kinds of filters and all kinds of like animations and additional things to do linking and brushing and aggregate and group and query and show additional attributes and so on. And that it was finally published at Viz in 2014. But it turns out the biggest thing that we did was later we wrote a paper, or we implemented a simple R plotting library for upset plots. And so a bioinformatician could now simply say, hey, I have the set data, show me an upset plot with a single command, right? And that was really when this became super popular. And since then, it's become the canonical way to show set data with 3 sets. It's the second most cited Viz paper of the last decade. And right now, 11 different, I know of 11 different implementation of people that are not affiliated with us that have built this in JavaScript, in R, in Tableau, and in Python, and so on. And we recently launched this upset.app website to kind of like explain what is upset, but also to show people, here are the different implementations, these are the pros and cons, these are the features that they all support, these are the languages that you could be using. Okay, so that was kind of just a quick introduction. Now I want to dive a little bit into the kind of research that I do so you get a sense of what I do, and I'll be focusing on 1 or 2 today. So the first thing I do is like technical contribution. So novel visualization techniques, just like the Viz stuff that you just saw earlier. Then there's like visualization process information or data wrangling methods. And one example, well, I'll give you an example of each of them. The second one that I do is domain-driven techniques. So we build tools that have an impact in a domain, and usually this is life science. This is also kind of like what our startup is about, right? We build visualizations that solve a problem in the life sciences. And then finally, I do a little bit of empirical and theoretical work. This is what I'll be talking mostly about today, evaluation methodology, and then we sometimes also do design space or taxonomy papers. So let me give you an example of a technical contribution in addition to upset. This here is like a vast paper from a couple of years ago. And the idea here was that like networks are really a great thinking tool, but networks are often not really you don't think about, or networks are not always in the format that you need to think about it. And so what you need to do is you need to transform a data set. So let's suppose you have a data set where you have scientific papers and authors. And what you really want to study is co-author relationship, right? So you have to do like a data wrangling step. And we did this data wrangling step for all kinds of different network operations in this particular tool that we published at last. An example of a domain-driven technique is lineage. And if I have time, I'll go into this today. This is kind of like a cool tool that we did for studying genealogies. The use case is a little bit less, let's say, positive. This is suicide data, but I'll show this to you later in more detail. And then finally, empirical and theoretical work, evaluation methodologies, and this is what I'll be jumping into right now. So the first part of what I'm talking about here is from a Chi paper in 2020. And so what we were trying to do is think about like, how can we actually like know between two different complex interactive visualization techniques, which of them is better for which task? And so typically, like if we run studies, we have like this spectrum here. So we have some simple perceptual studies, like what's the just noticeable difference in color, or do I perceive, let's say, a pi segment as accurately as a square or something like that, right? Then we have some static visualizations that might have a little bit more information. Then we might have controlled interaction. And then on the right, we might have complex visualization techniques. There's things that like interactive, like what I showed earlier with upset, or things like an interactive parallel coordinates plot, or anything like that. And then maybe on the further right, which I'm not even showing here, there would be like complete systems, right, that are deployed and are being used by people. And so typically what people do is we kind of know how to quantitatively study the first three of them here. Especially, we also know how to use them in crowdsourced setting. And crowdsourcing is kind of like, you know, I'm really excited about crowdsourcing because it's just so convenient to get large samples, large numbers of people to participate in your study. So this is what we typically use, or these are the kinds of studies we typically do in the crowd. Then for complex visualization techniques, people usually say this doesn't really work with crowdsourcing because, and also even like for any kind of controlled study, because there's so many different factors that you might consider and so on. So this is kind of like what we want to push on. Can we do quantitative crowdsourced studies for these complex visualization techniques? So what we did here is we looked at two different network visualization techniques, an adjacency matrix and a node link diagram, but not only just an adjacency matrix, but we also show lots of attributes. So here we have our traditional adjacency matrix on the left, and on the right we have a tabular representation. This is a social network from a Eurovis conference that we downloaded from Twitter, and then we show how many likes does a person have, how many follows does a person have, how many tweets did they tweet, and so on. And then the connectivity here shows how people interacted within the Eurovis conference with the Eurovis hashtag, basically. Then we have some categorical data, such as like, are they a person or an institutional account, and which continent are they from, right? So this is a fairly complicated technique. You have a lot of interactive features. It has lots of complicated encodings. You have to explain this to people, but it might be better if you actually know what you're doing. The alternative that we used was a node link diagram, which I'll show later. And the question that we kind of wanted to ask is, can we use empirical studies to evaluate this kind of complex interactive visualization techniques? And so the reason why we chose these techniques is because we had just written the state-of-the-art report on multivariate network visualization, right? So we really dug into all the literature on network visualization that also considers attributes, and we thought about all of them, and we kind of like, in our analysis, we found, of course, that adjacency matrices and node link diagrams are the most commonly used, but there wasn't any study that actually studied attribute, like, is there, do any of them have benefits if you also consider attributes? And so that's what we wanted to do. So which one of those is better for which task? The problem with using interactive techniques, and this is like a screenshot of an example that we used for a node link diagram, is of course confounders, right? Like when you usually design a study, you try to vary only one little thing between the two conditions, and then you can reliably say, yes, this is better because of this, right? Well, reliably to some degree, but at least you have a good hint that the reason for the difference is what you carefully controlled. The problem is that you cannot really control anything here, right? Because there are two completely different techniques. So I can't control for like, you know, how well is this implemented, or is this like an equivalent operation, and so on. And so how did we tackle this? Well, we thought about this, and we thought about it a lot. And the problem is that what we want to do is we design based on existing guidelines and knowledge. So we didn't go out and invent a new technique and then try to test this to somebody else, something else. But we looked at the literature and we saw there was a lot of support for those two different techniques. We saw many different implementations, and then we set out to build our own just for this study. and to design it based on best practices. And then, like, of course, you can say, yeah, I designed it best on what I think are best practices, but that's still a problem, right? How do I know that I'm right? And so what we did then is we used this paper from Georgia Tech that is about heuristic evaluation of visualization techniques. And so we built a survey that we sent to experts, to network visualization experts, and asked them to evaluate our techniques. And we improved our techniques based on the feedback that we got until we kind of like had consensus among a group of experts that these are like very good representations of the visualization technique. And so this is what we call this validated design. So now we have like a good, like, or best possible representative example of a specific visualization technique. The other thing that, of course, we need to do this because like this is kind of like fuzzy. We need to do this at scale, right? If we do this in a lab, we might not actually get numbers that are meaningful. We might not, for example, there is like, you can solve certain tasks in many different ways. If you have only 15 participants and 5 of them do it the wrong way, then you might be kind of like screwed already, right? So you need like a large sample here. And then of course, we need to do this in a crowdsourced setting. That of course makes it tricky, because if you bring somebody in, you can do like an hour-and-a-half session with them, right? You can sit them down, you can explain your technique. But if you do this on the web in crowdsourcing, you need to be very careful about this. So everybody that you can find in a crowdsourced engine is typically a novice user, especially if you're talking about special visualization technique, right? So they have no idea about advanced data visualization. So what you need to do is you need to make your novices experts within your study. And so we designed trainings for them. So we first had like a passive training phase where we kind of like explained the principles of adjacency matrices and how we visualize attributes about them. And that took about like 7 or 8 minutes. They basically watched the video, and we also made sure that they actually watched it and not just skipped ahead. Then we followed this up by active training. So here, this is like now in the tool with kind of like a guided tour of the tool where you get instructed to do something. Like here's the task, read the task, search for a specific node, right? So here we're trying to get them familiar with the tool. And then finally, we even had trials, like they had to do some tasks and with controlled answers. And if they actually were able to solve these, then we let them proceed. Okay, so now we made our novice users slight experts in the visualization techniques that we had. The next problem is, of course, like especially on Amazon Mechanical Turk, people try to game the system, right? They try to do something as quickly as possible to get the reward, but not to spend too much effort. And so people are sloths, basically. How can we get users to really try hard? And how can we get them to participate in an experiment that takes an hour? On crowdsourced studies, what often happens, or in crowd tasks more generally, these are usually micro tasks, right? Where it takes maybe a minute or maybe even 20 seconds or 5 minutes, but there is barely anybody running experiments on crowdsourcing that take an hour. So that's kind of like another challenge that you have to think about. And the solution here is actually simple. The most important one is money. Pay them well. If you pay people well, way better than the typical task, then you get their attention, right? Then people are suddenly eager to participate in your task. And so what you can see here, this is like a screenshot from Prolific. We paid on average $16 an hour. And most people on crowdsourcing platforms, there's different studies. Prolific enforces now $8. So we pay twice as much almost as Prolific enforces. On Amazon Mechanical Turk, most people get paid like $2 or $3 an hour, right? So we paid about 5 times as well as your typical crowdsourced participant. And of course, like there was a lot of people who wanted to do a study. And so we actually burned through $4,500 in 2 hours. Within 2 hours, we had all of the data, right? So there was like lots of preparation there, but actually collecting the data was like a matter of minutes. And my student, Carolina, she told me this was like the most mind-numbing thing, that she was clicking start and then she saw all of those people and then the money flying out the window. Well, the other thing that we found is that most of these studies that people do are really boring, right? They get to like click on the car in the picture, or answer these questions, or do these kinds of tasks. So they're not used to seeing complex visualizations. And the feedback we got after the study from people was that they were super excited about having such an interesting task, right? Of course, not everybody. But you also see that here in the green buttons, like basically this is how many people, like the people that completed the task. And so you see that a lot of people tried it out and returned it immediately. And then we also didn't have to pay them, right? But it was kind of very easy to get the participants. And we've run a couple of studies like this. And I also can really recommend Prolific. So that has been like a very good experience. So the next thing is, of course, validation. So the first thing that you need to do, like if you're in a lab, right, and if you're sitting and observing your users, you kind of get an idea of what are the problems with your system. You can't watch what a crowdsourced user is doing, at least typically not. And what we did is we instrumented the hell out of our tools, right? So we tracked everything, every little detail, every button, like and so on. So we really knew exactly what was going on in every particular session. And we used this also to run pilots, right? So we'd run a pilot with 3 users, and then we would look at exactly what they did. And we would find, okay, they got stuck here, or they got stuck here, or maybe they didn't find that button, or maybe that task was too complicated. So we ran many of those iterations. And because we collected this super detailed data, we were able to look at what's going on. And this is like a visualization that we purposely built to debug pilots. So here we looked at a trial. This is like a single trial, and you see like how long did they take for each task, when did they browse away, how long did they take on the trials, what did they do, and so on. Did they get it correct? What are the actions, and so on. This is like only for internal use. This isn't necessarily a great visualization. I'll talk later about how you can do this now in a better way. What we were using to do all of this instrumentation is actually a tool that we built ourselves, which we call Track. If you've seen my other talk that I gave at VRS, I talked a lot about provenance tracking, right, and about instrumenting visualization tools. And so this is kind of like a provenance tracking tool for interactive web systems. It tracks a differential state of an application on a semantic level. And for user studies, like we use this all the time for our applications, so that we have kind of like undo, redo, or that we can like store your session, or we can even build an analysis story out of what you did, or we can even reuse a workflow. This is like a paper that we'll be presenting at Eurovis. But here we're using this Track tool to track 2 different things. So first, to track the application state, which we can use to debug, but also we can use to see what people actually did in the system. And we also use Track a second time to track study metadata, right? So any responses or anything like that, all of that also happens with Track. And so if you're building a visualization system and you wanted to add provenance, you can go to this link and you can look at Track and add it to your system if you want to. There's plenty of examples in well-documented code, and this is also being actively developed. So the cool thing about all of this is this allows us to fully rehydrate every analysis session. So I'll show a video later that shows you that. But the point of this is really that we can jump in and see somebody got a task wrong and see why. We can like actually look at what they did. And it's also great for detailed analysis. So you can, for example, look at somebody in the actual study who got it wrong, and then you want to see why did they get it wrong. And you might get hints by looking at what they actually did, like a video almost. But even better because you can navigate by events. Okay, so now maybe the least interesting part of this study was the results. Most people don't really care so much about multivariate network visualization, to be honest. I think we found some cool things, but you know, I'm more excited about the methodology, but I'll still show you some results. So you have these 2 techniques. Here's like a complex version of the node link diagram, and people had to do things like do path-based tasks or analyze, you know, are there people that are very central to the network, also kind of the ones that are that tweet the most, and so on. And with all of these 2 different techniques, in total there were 16 tasks. I'll show you some selected results. So the first one, obviously, if you've ever read a paper about adjacency matrices, everybody says they're not great for path-based tasks. So if I want to see how our 2 nodes connected, That works well if they are in like direct neighbors in an adjacency matrix, but it really doesn't work well if you have to have multiple hops. And so, not surprising, like if I wanted to ask how is Lane connected to Rob in a node link diagram, this is easy, right? We immediately see there's multiple possible connections. They have like a distance of 1 or 1 node in between them, 1 hop in between them. In an adjacency matrix, this is much harder. And so we saw this. Attributes, like you see the node link diagram here is in orange, the adjacency matrix here is in blue, and you see the accuracy for attribute along shortest path or attribute of multiple path here are like consistently very high for node link diagrams and fairly low for adjacency matrices, and similarly the time people took a long time in adjacency matrices. This was kind of like expected and not particularly surprising. The thing that we found more interesting is to understand that these two different visualization techniques actually show different things and support different kinds of insights. And so we were also analyzing the types of insights. We had like open tasks. Tell us what you like, analyze this network and write down what you see, right? And again, probably because we paid them so well, people actually did that, right? There wasn't any validation or check, but people wrote like paragraphs of an analysis of what they saw in these networks. Not everybody, of course, but like 1 out of 3 wrote a lot of stuff in here. And so what we saw is that adjacency matrices really like they focus on the attributes, right? People tend to like look at the attributes and look less at the topology. So we got quotes such as institutions have much fewer tweets in general than personal accounts. And if you think about how Twitter works, that makes sense, right? Because a lot of people on Twitter post everything about their like what they had for breakfast or where they're like their cat sleeping, but nobody would go in and use like a university or a lab account to post these kind of things, right? So there's way fewer tweets associated with institutional accounts. But this kind of insight wasn't something that we saw in a node link diagram, but in the node link diagram, we saw other aspects that look a little bit more at topology. So topology attribute relationships. So for example, they were looking at the nodes Alex, Jeffrey, and Rob, and they essentially said it does seem a bit odd that Jeffrey, Alex, and Rob have such large networks with their lower than average tweeting. So they saw these people are very central to the network and they're very connected, but they don't actually tweet a lot. So again, fairly interesting and something that we didn't observe in the adjacency matrix. There's more results if you care about networks. Take a look at the paper. But to recap, in terms of the methodology, can we do quantitative evaluation with complex system? Yes, we can, but you have to pick the right techniques. You have to use evidence-based design. You have to validate your design. You have to do careful training. You have to pay your participants well, and you have to give them interesting tasks. And then, of course, you have to instrument all of this and then analyze the data. So we were hoping, and I think we kind of like achieved to push the boundary of what can be evaluated using crowdsourcing. But of course, there's caveats here. So one important takeaway is this should not be the gold standard to evaluate systems, right? If you build a new technique and you want to demonstrate that it's better than something else, you should probably not use this approach. You should really only use this approach if you go into this neutrally and design both conditions from scratch and using best practices. If you build a system and you want to say that it's better than somebody else's system, that's clearly not going to work, right? Because like your system might have slight usability benefits, you might not be as careful as designing the alternative condition and so on. So you should definitely not use this to evaluate your fancy new technique. So you need established techniques. They need to be specifically designed and instrumented systems. But of course, some parts of what we're doing here, especially our instrumentation, can be used broadly in very different tasks as well. So we've been using this now, this kind of setup in many different applications. So the other thing that like basically this is what we did for Chi 2020, and then we kind of thought a little bit more about the data that we got. And for Chi 21, we actually thought about, okay, we see some weird things in the data, right? And we wanted to dig in what's going on if people do these complex tasks. And so what we did here is we thought about how can we analyze this data, and mostly how can we analyze event sequences. And so we built this tool, Revisit, where we kind of like use these intermittent studies and ask the question, what else can we do with this rich data? And most importantly, do people have different analysis strategies? And how are the analysis strategies related to the outcomes, right? So for example, if you have a tool that has a feature to sort, like an adjacency matrix that has a feature to sort, to bring up all the neighbors of a particular node, right? And you ask are these two nodes connected? If you're using the sorting, you will most likely get the answer much quicker and more reliably than if you don't use the sorting, right? But we don't force people to use the sorting. And so we kind of want to understand what strategies for which technique actually work. Because like potentially you could even hint that to people, right? That if they need to do something, we can hint at, in a system, we could hint at, hey, here's this functionality that could help you achieve that. So here's kind of exactly the example that I showed you. The green nodes here highlight kind of like the neighborhoods. And we have like one participant who uses this neighborhood, highlighting the other participant who doesn't. And so how does this impact user performance when using interactive visualization? And so typically what happens when you run a study, you do your study design, you do your instrumentation, you run the study, then you do some data analysis, mostly with some statistical tools or some plotting, right? And then you have your analysis outcomes. But what we really wanted to do is we wanted to take the push up the data analysis part a notch and really look at event sequences. So here we have like quantitative analysis, then we did event sequence mining. We also included some qualitative analysis features, so you could kind of like take responses and directly build categories in this interactive tool, and then compare these categories and so on. And then we have the event playback. And so I'm gonna show you a video that like gives you a live demo of this, including audio. These are the two students who led this project who are speaking now.
There is a researcher recently ran a user study analyzing the performance of network visualizations. This study compares node diagrams to adjacency matrices for finding paths in a network. During her study design, Heather had balanced interactions available to both node length and matrices, not necessarily favor one condition or the other. An important part of finding a path in the network is being able to identify neighboring nodes. In the node length, this can easily be done by clicking on the node to highlight neighbors. In the adjacency matrix, Heather added an interaction that highlighted neighbors in green when a user clicks the column label. Now, she wants to be able to assess whether or not this added interaction actually helps improve performance for the adjacency matrix. Heather moves over to the revisit system on the page. Here, she can see a high-level overview of how her participants performed on each of her tasks, as well as the main interaction patterns used in those tasks. Hovering over the interaction patterns, she notices that users who use the column label interaction performed at around 70% accuracy, comparatively to the 60% accuracy without. She wants to drill down into this a little bit more. So she goes into the task analysis pane, and then first groups on condition. Then she wants to group upon whether or not a user used column label. So, grouping on that and expanding the columns, you can see that users of the column label interaction technique have a 67% accuracy compared to a 45% accuracy for the participants who did not use the column label technique. Having validated that there exists a pretty large difference between the accuracies of individuals who use the column label, she wanted to drill down into exactly how those individuals who don't use the column label go about solving this task for adjacency matrix. As she's interested inside the answers that they gave as well, she goes, unhides that column, and then scrolls down to look at how the individuals who didn't use the column label approach this task. As she scrolls down, she sees a fair amount of these answers of end use. As this is an incorrect answer to the problem, she delves in to the playback interaction to see how users are using this to solve the problem. Playing through each of the strategies, she sees that the user search and then select for MUs, which is located right in between lane and rod. Interested by this, she sees that likelihood is occurring is users are looking directly in between lane and rod in selecting the node that exists between them that is an institution, which corresponds to MUs. This represents a conceptual misunderstanding of how edges are visualized inside of an adjacency matrix.
This methodology was employed to analyze data from 2 published crowdsourced user studies, which we present as case studies in the paper. The combined analysis of study results with the interaction patterns helped our analysts uncover novel interaction strategies, identify gaps in participant training, and measure the impact of design decisions used in the study. You can check out our visit at this URL. Thanks for watching our video.
Okay, so I was very excited by this work because I think it's also broadly applicable for other kinds of things, right? It's great if you know what people are trying to achieve in a study, but potentially you could use something like this also for like open exploration of tools. And now, given this work that we've done, we actually applied for like a big NSF instrumentation grant. Lane Harrison, Carolina, Norva, and myself. And what we want to do is we want to build infrastructure for other visualization researchers that they can run these studies more efficiently, right? So that you can like essentially have a configuration where you can specify like your task and point them to your code. And then this will build up all of the scaffolding and deploy it and send it like and make it available and prolific. And so there are like many different things that we want to do in this aim. But I just want to basically mention, like, if you're interested in running a study like this, reach out. I'm happy to connect, and I'm happy to kind of give you some pointers what you can do already right now. And especially if we end up getting money for this, we hope to build like a community platform to do this kind of work. Okay, since we have about 20 minutes left, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about like a domain-specific visualization technique. And this was the suicide data set that I mentioned earlier. So this is a project that we did together with researchers in psychiatry. And the problem that they were trying to understand is like, what are the factors that contribute to suicide? And suicide is like a big public health problem, right? There's about 1 person dying of suicide every 40 seconds, and it's like one of the leading causes of death for young people, especially. Turns out Utah, where we're located, is part of this Intermountain West corridor, where suicide is an especially pronounced problem. So we have much more suicides than most other states in the Intermountain West. And the suicide rate in Utah is the 5th highest in the country. And so there's like about 3 million people in Utah, and 500 to 600 people kill themselves every year, which is like pretty much, right? And our collaborators are studying what is going on here. So that turns out this is a paper by our collaborators that air pollution is a risk factor for suicide. There's other things, of course, social isolation, personal tragedy, and so on. But it turns out there's also genetics that play a role in suicide. And this is our collaborator, our main collaborator, Hillary Kuhn. She is a bioinformatician, geneticist, and psychiatrist. And she studies these genetic risk factors in Utah. And the other thing that's interesting about Utah, well, we want to understand complex conditions and discover genetic risk factors. The thing that's interesting about why this is cool to do in Utah is we have this Utah population database. And so if you know anything about Utah, you probably know that there's a Mormon church, right? And if you know the Mormon church, you might know that they're very good at collecting records about their members and their family lineages, but they also kind of are super into genealogy, and they have been assembling family genealogies from all over the world, but especially from Utah for the last 200 years. And so we have this amazing resource of very large family pedigrees. And our collaborators have been using these family pedigrees and enrich them with genetic data. So basically everybody who died in Utah in the last 5 to 7 years from suicide, we have their genetic material, and we can associate it with the family pedigrees. And so our data set here has 118,000 people, 19,000 suicide cases, and 2,000 of them with genomic data. in 550 extended families. So what we exactly wanted to do is we wanted to find familial cases that have an interesting phenotype. We typically, like, genetics probably don't play a role if somebody kills themselves at 75. They're more likely that there's some environmental circumstances, they might have gotten cancer or they might be in pain, right? Really interesting are young cases, or turns out that women kill themselves much less frequently than men. They attempt it more often, but succeed less frequently. So they're also very interested in families that have like very high rates of successful female suicides, or associated with rare psychiatric diseases. For example, everybody who commits suicide is likely depressed, but very few people actually have personality disorders, right? And so they want to see whether these kinds of attributes are enriched in families. And so what they want to do then is they want to pick those families and cases and then do like a detailed analysis of their genetics with shared genomic sequence analysis. And so the other thing, every time you build a visualization tool, people also want to proofread their data and make sure that what they have is correct. So this is how a typical family pedigree looks like. This is not the genealogy that you would do if you like want to understand your ancestry, but this is like for genetics. So we're looking at people that are related to each other. And so we start from a founder and then fan to the bottom, whereas you personally might go back up to your ancestors, right? But here we have like males in squares, females in circles. The dark ones are by convention what's the phenotype of interest. In our case here, suicide, but it could be cancer or heart disease or anything like that. The problem that we have is, again, the network visualization problem. We have like this tree here, and then we have many of these attributes that we also want to understand, such as age, sex, race, whether they were bipolar, they had depression, asthma, and so on, all of those different things. However, like a typical Utah family looks like this. This is a very, very large family pedigree with about 400 members, and this is like only 6-7 generations or so. And this is rendered using a commercial genealogy drawing tool. And I'm also showing you 2 or 3 attributes, but none of you can tell me anything about them, right? Because they're way too small, you can't see them. So you have a problem of scale here. And so to address this, we built this tool, which we call Lineage, that kind of like really focuses only on the people of interest. And so here on the left, we have kind of like a family selector where you can pick families based on attributes. And then here we have like a genealogy visualization. And then on the right here, we have attributes about those people. And so I'll dig into this a little bit in more detail now. The trick that we are applying here is linearization. So here we have a tree, and if we want to visualize attributes about those people, what we can do is we can kind of create a linearization of this tree so that each of these nodes has kind of like space to the right? And then we can actually show attributes about them in a table. Kind of like that's a simple thing that you can do so that you can actually show plenty of attribute about all of those people. And so that was kind of like the first idea. It turns out that this is actually not all that interesting because these families have a lot of people in them that didn't kill themselves. And then we don't have a lot of data about them. They're still interesting to understand the relationships between people, but we don't actually need to see their data. And so what we did is then we built some aggregation. So we can't show all that many people. This isn't particularly scalable. And we have all of this missing data on the right here. And so we came up with this kind of like aggregation method. So this is like what like a large-ish family of a male and a female, they would have 3 daughters and 2 sons. 2 of them deceased, 1 of them has the phenotype of interest, the suicide case. So this is like your traditional diagram. And we kind of like built this much more compact representation that focuses only on the people that have that phenotype of interest. So we see the family structure, but it really focuses on this person that killed themselves. And then we can actually show lots of data about this particular person, and we have a compact representation. So this is what this tool ended up looking like. Here we have like one family, like I'm sorting by age, so I can sort by different attributes. PD here are personality disorders, these rare diseases. Now I'm kind of starring that PD, and now I'm seeing like in all of these other families, are there other families that are enriched for personality disorders, and I can add those families to my exploration. And now I can start to exploring do those people that have personality disorders have anything in common? Are they like much more frequent in one particular family than in another, and so on? And so this way you can kind of explore very efficiently. And like right now we're looking at, I don't know the exact numbers, but we're looking probably at families with like about 600 or 800 people in a very compact representation here, right? So currently this is used by a team of psychiatry researchers on a basically daily basis. We've since built also like things like air quality data into it. And there's also widespread interest from other labs to work with that work with UPDB data. This genealogy graphs, they are like a very commonly used resource in Utah. There's lots of cancer researchers and heart disease researchers that are also using them. And so we are working on deploying this with them. And there's also plenty of other data. We've already done some of the integration of environmental data, but it would also be interesting to directly show geospatial and genomic data in these pedigrees. So with that, I want to wrap up and take 10 minutes for questions. I hope it was interesting, and I showed you two very different projects, but I hope I didn't lose you in the transition.
Thank you, Alex. Are there any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. This was a very engaging talk. I'm interested in your last example. So finally, did people find out some of the reasons why the people are killing themselves in the mountain?
So there are theories. Well, all of these countries, all of these states are fairly conservative. So they are like right-leaning with lots of pressure about family. But there's also they're also high altitude and have a lot of solar radiation. So that also contributes to that. It's also very white, so not very racially diverse, all of those states, right? So there are theories that this contributes to it. And especially Utah has a severe air pollution problem because it has this inversion like Graz. And there's like industry and then lots of traffic and so on. Everybody basically in Utah lives in the Salt Lake Valley where we have this air pollution. And so all of those things play a role and interact, but I think it's not one thing, right? It's like an aggregate of these different factors. There's like, for example, southern US also has very conservative families, right? So it can't just be politics or families, but you know, it's probably a factor, and combined with other things like high altitude living and solar irradiation might be some of the reasons. Yeah.
So has the distribution of the suicide rate been taken into consideration? Like Utah and California, and these are huge states. So for example, the Golden Bridge in San Francisco is very well known for suicide. Yes. So if you take that into consideration, maybe it will sort of...
No, these numbers are of course adjusted for population, right? So this is not absolute cases. Like we have, like California has, I'm sure, thousands of suicide cases a year, but also 50 or 80 million people versus Utah only has 3 million people, right? So there could be some effect of small numbers, but I think Utah is big enough that that doesn't play all that big of a role.
Thank you very much for the nice talk. So I'm particularly interested in the first example that you described. So you were talking about provenance, and I was curious whether you have considered or maybe thought together with your collaborators about how you could maybe use this information from the provenance to create perhaps better guidance mechanisms that could actually help you with this replicability issue for different databases?
Yes. The short answer is you should watch another talk. The longer answer is yes, this is super exciting, right? So there, I think of provenance as two big benefits. First, well, clearly you have a record of what you've done, but you can also kind of like reuse that record to tell somebody else what you did, so you can use it to share. And you could even go in and curate your provenance graph and clean it up, right? So that you have only like a neat analysis process where all of your like detours, they don't show up, right? And then you could create kind of a workflow from it. And you could say,
this is how you clean up this kind of data. And you could give this to like a new employee in your company, and they could walk through that, and they could potentially even use that workflow to get started with their data cleanup job that they have, right? And so this is exactly the kind of work that we'll be presenting at Eurovis, where we kind of capture these smart workflows and where you can use them later for maybe training, for guidance, for onboarding. So all of those would be interesting applications. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions actually about the crowdsourcing approach. The first one is, obviously you exclude the users who didn't finish the task.
Yes.
But what about, I mean, you always have the attention problem, right? You can crowdsource the tasks, and maybe we have this kind of attention task, like it's very, in shorter studies, you have the attention task, and then you can somehow find out if the user was seriously working on it. Do you have any of these mechanisms?
So we didn't have a formal mechanism, we looked at it, right? We didn't include everybody who was not finishing all of it, right? We only excluded people who dropped out early without doing any of the tasks. So when people did tasks, we often included the data and we also paid them. But lots of people start out and drop out immediately without giving you anything interesting, or they see that they have to watch an 8-minute video and then they said, okay, I'm not going to do anything.
So the takeaway message is basically, if you have such a long study, you don't need an attention task, because somebody who doesn't take it seriously will finish the video.
So generally, I think we didn't do, like I would generally do it, right? I would generally recommend doing these attention tasks, but we didn't do it because we didn't see any problems in our pilot. So we basically saw that the quality was fairly high and people engaged. And so we didn't feel the need to do some kind of like weird task in the middle. Probably would have been better if we did it just for rigor, right? Just to make sure that we have comparison to like whatever. We could say, hey, people are really still paying attention. So I guess if I did it again, I might still include it, but we didn't do it because we didn't see a problem with the data.
And another thought that I had is like these complex systems are at the level of the algorithm more quantitative.
Yeah.
Have you had any idea? I mean, this reporting the insights is obviously something we also did that in the study previously. Any other ideas how we can get something more quantitative out of this?
Yeah, so like this is kind of like, you know, I'm a big fan of qualitative studies. We do this a lot. This isn't meant to replace them, right? It's meant for like this very specific case where you have but you really want to know more, like, and get some sense of quantitative for like a larger group of people. I think insight tracking is also very fraught, right? I think one aspect that I like thinking aloud is something that might even be like one thing that we want to do in this research project that I kind of sketched is like do a study like we did in crowdsourcing, but allow people to think aloud, right? And so we can like record the audio, we can record everything that they do, and then we could kind of like do, you know, an analysis of what did they do? Did they get it right? And then we could look at the individual, kind of like we could automatically transcribe the text, which works fairly well, right? And we could kind of like have keywords. And so we could build like a system that allows us to look at these think aloud studies at scale. I'm sure it's like, you can abuse this, but it might be also interesting to play with this kind of data. Like your question about whether I have other ideas for qualitative data analysis.
Well, audio recording, that's an
Yes.
I mean, I don't know how well it would work for cognitive, but it probably narrows the user range for you to do it.
Yeah.
You have to pay even more.
Yes. I don't know. I've not. Our experience with Prolific has been excellent. It's much, much better than MS. Like if you want to improve your results, the simple thing you can do is switch from Amazon Mechanical to Prolific and your results are going to be much, much better. Like 3 times as much.
But prolific has the disadvantage that you have to, like, if you want to do some screening for the users, it's
So it doesn't have as many tools.
and like color blindness. You can exclude people because of color blindness.
Well, you might have to do it yourself. I don't actually know what they support now. They're getting better, right? And they also have partners now that have these kinds of like scaffoldings for basic surveys and so on. So you can like use SurveyMonkey combined with Prolific, or there's other tools that they have. And hopefully 3 years from now, when we have this grant, you could use our tools to do something like this easily. But I don't think this is kind of a prolific scope, right? They use third parties to provide that kind of functionality, which Amazon Mechanical Turk might include directly.
Any more questions?
Yes. Regarding the suicide data set again, so I noticed that there were a lot more suicides in modern generations and less in older generations. Is that because we lack data for that? Or is it because it's a modern society problem?
So as an interesting topic that we always talk about with our people, these families are mostly Mormon, and there's a stigma associated with suicide, right? And now if you die, you get seen by a coroner, and the coroner makes a decision whether this was a suicide or not. 50 years ago, it was the family doctor or nobody at all. And since there was so much stigma about suicide, it just wasn't recorded as a suicide, right? So we might not have that data for very old cases, but even where we have the data for the cause of death in the 60s or 70s, it might not be correctly coded, right? Just because families insisted that this wasn't suicide because of all the stigma that is associated with it. So you have to be aware of that problem with the data when you want to study that. It is kind of like a little bit of a problem, but also not all that problematic for this particular question, because we also don't have other data for those people, right? We don't have genetics, we don't have, like, for recent cases, we have all kinds of ICD codes, like these codes for diagnostic of diseases. These are the things that you really want to look at. And if you don't have that from like 1920, it doesn't matter all that much, right? It still would be interesting to see these rich patterns. What they often do is they speculate, you know, if you really look in detail at the pedigree, and you see that in the 1920s, there were like 3 people that died at 19, and it's a very family that's very enriched for suicide. They will kind of like speculate that this person has actually committed suicide. And so that's actually another research topic that I call data hunters, right? Like expert knowledge or expert speculation. How can you record that? How can you make that part of your analysis? But it's a different topic.
You said that in your comparison of the adjacency matrix with the no-think diagram, the results were not so in the focus. So did you find out something that was surprising you? And the second would be, where's the limit of how much domain knowledge such a system requires? You know, if you have a system that requires a lot of domain knowledge, probably this is not possible to be able to onboard the people.
Yes, so the most surprising thing for us was what I kind of mentioned, is that people answer, like if you ask them what do you see, they give very different answers for those 2 approaches, right? So you basically see different things, even though it's the same data, same task, you see different things depending on which visualization technique you use. So what we learn is basically by picking a visualization technique, you bias your results already, right? Like you bias what you find in quite a significant way. I think that was the most interesting piece. For your second question, yes, this doesn't work for something that is very, very complicated, right? So if you know, I don't know, have a system that has many different steps, or have a system where you really need to learn and then coding or something like that, it might be tricky. I think, for example, if you want to study t-SNE or something like that, right? Some projection, you can probably train people to do that. But if it's something more complicated, right, then there's certainly a limit, right? You can probably find out in the pilot if you well, a pilot is of course late because you have already implemented everything. But you can probably see in the pilot whether people can actually do the task.
Are there no questions from the remote audience? So many people.
Well, you should ask somebody directly.
But there's also, is there something in the chat? No.
No, it's not. I'm watching it.
I was one question about your evaluation tool. So it's currently supporting between subjects design. It doesn't have any randomization of.
We did build this stuff in, but it, you know.
That would be interesting.
Yes. So we did actually both between this. The node link was a between subjects, but we did it within subject study as well. With it on a different task, a simpler task, and it, you know, this is just, we implemented everything from scratch ourselves, so you can create your own randomization strategies. But in the tool that we want to build, this would be like one option, right? Like, what's your randomization strategy?
Yeah. And maybe one last study is, did you actually, maybe in a pilot test, like the impact of the training period on the results?
So let me think about it. I think we didn't study formally.
Yeah.
We did see that our first pilot didn't work because people didn't know what they were doing. And that's when we added this extensive training.
I think that's an interesting question, how to design this kind
Yes.
of training videos and training tasks. So we train the users in short periods
Yes.
of time. I think that's a question on its own.
Yes, I agree. It is hard, and it takes a lot of time. Like in these studies, it took something between 15 and 18 minutes just to train them.
So the effect of me asking if there's a question that the remote audience is the remote audience going to wait pretty much. Okay, but we're at the end. And, oh no, we're not at the end. Last word.
No, this is just a minor one. The upset design is great. Did you think about how you order the sets, that the visual prominence might be different? Like if you have two dots next to each other, they are connected with a line. If the dots are not next to each other, they are not. So are you thinking about what would be the best arrangement?
So not in the order of sets, we don't do anything there, nothing to optimize, but they still get connected. I think I don't know, but I would hope it shouldn't matter. The one thing that is much more important actually, and that's a problem sometimes, that's why I always like, well, this goes into detail now, but the biggest problem is if you have sets of very different sizes. That's easy to see in a Venn diagram, right? If you have like if you have an area proportional Venn diagram and you have like a very large set and a very small set, you can see that immediately, right? And you wouldn't misjudge any of the intersections. That's a bit of a problem in an upset because this is like it's part of the technique. It shows you this in the bars at the top, but you have to think about it a little bit more. And so that's why we also have Helvig and Bilal, they built a system a while ago where they introduced a metric for like a surprise measure of the size of an intersection, right? And so we also, in the more advanced versions, we also show that surprise measure. And I think if you judge those two together, you get a good sense of like what's actually going on. But if you don't, it can be complicated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.